Dr. Impey, would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm Chris Impey. I'm a professor of astronomy at the University of Arizona, and I've been doing research here and public outreach and public speaking my whole time as a faculty member, about 35 years.
So when did you start speaking publicly about your research?
I think I started when I was a graduate student. I was in the UK, actually, at Edinburgh, at the University of Edinburgh. And they have there's an observatory there, historical observatory that has public lectures in the public. It's a very iconic building in the middle of Edinburgh. So I was sort of swept into, invited to give a talk there, a public talk, and I'm sure it filled me with trepidation and fear, but it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, or as difficult. So that sort of started it off. And then when I had opportunities as a graduate student, I usually took advantage of them. And then it just became a habit. Then it became something I do. And then, to be honest, as a professional scientist, an astronomer, we are essentially paid by the taxpayer to do our work. And so we actually have an obligation to help transmit the results of our research to the public, because they're the ones paying the bills. So, it's not that, you have to do it necessarily, but there's some societal obligation for researchers who are paid with public funds to not keep it to themselves and sort of share the wealth.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think one of the things that I want to focus on when I write the article about public speaking is how important it is to be able to just communicate your research back to the people who it's for and who are funding it. Because we learn so many abstract topics specifically to help them, and then ironically it becomes harder and harder to communicate them.
And I'd say there's a second large reason too, and this is not equally true in all fields, but in science definitely true. We're living in an age of misinformation. There's a lot of fake news and a lot of fake science out there, most of it on the internet. And, again, scientists who are in the business of, gaining knowledge or learning facts or verifying things that we believe to be true also have an obligation to contribute to fighting misinformation. And one of the ways you fight misinformation is to put the right information out there. So you have to be out there. It's very hard to beat social media because it spreads misinformation in a viral way. But you can also do social media as a scientist. So you can use all the tools that are used to spread fake news, to spread correct information. And I think that's another obligation we have, because it's a real societal problem, misinformation.
So I guess I did want to ask if you faced any challenges when you started speaking publicly, aside from just trepidation. Were there any specific things that you had to kind of process or deal with to fully get into presenting?
Yes, I think especially I can still remember when I was doing it when I was a graduate student or postdoc. When I started out, I was worried. I was definitely worried about finding the right level, how to pitch. I was sensitive to not talking down to people or oversimplifying. And I was equally sensitive to blowing people away with jargon or technical knowledge. And it's tricky because when you're a young professional, when you're learning your field for the first time, you sort of want to feel the power of your knowledge, and you want to show off a little, you want to show what you know. So there's probably a tendency to aim it a little too high, just to show all the stuff that even if it's not about jargon, just pitching it a little too high a level. And so I was always worried about how to find that middle ground, or what is the middle ground anyway? Does it even mean anything? Because that raises the question of who's your audience? Because in a public speaking situation, it's not really one person. You could have in astronomy, you could have amateur astronomers who know an awful lot of stuff that's going on, but they could have brought their 8-year-old kid, who's just not interested in science, that doesn't know anything. So you tend to have mixed audiences. So it's really hard to know even who your typical audience is. And probably another thing I worry about, which I can understand, and that doesn't always go away, is, what if you would get asked the impossible question? All sorts of possibilities. Like, what if you get asked a kind of aggressive question, and how do you deal with that? Or what if you ask a question where you don't even understand the question, so you don't know how to answer it? How do you gracefully do that? Or what if you get asked a truly difficult question? Is it okay to just stand there and formulate your answer, or do you need to be quick and deliver something quickly? So being asked tough, difficult, or challenging questions is a natural concern.
Did you find anything that helped you find the middle ground and to answer questions?
Sure. I mean, you got to use your friends and your peer network and so on. So when I was a graduate student, I had friends who were they weren't scientists. They may have been graduate students, but in totally different fields, in the arts or humanities or something like that, or just friends, just other friends who are not students at all, and use them as an audience. I mean, it doesn't have to go to the full extent of a practice talk in front of a bunch of friends. That's sometimes hard to arrange, but it's not a bad idea. In our department, our graduate students, it's not for public speaking, but our graduate students do practice talks for their prelims and their thesis defenses all the time, multiple iterations, and it's very valuable. So I think doing a practice talk, even if it's just with your roommate, is fine. And it just helps because they're gonna respond to it in an honest way, and they may tell you something you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. So practicing, obviously, with whoever you can find to practice. And if you're worried about over pitching it, then find a relative or family member, your grandmother or something like that, and then you can genuinely find out if you're just overfilled with jargon and making it too high level. That's the best way, because that stops you just going in cold. The worst thing is to feel you're going in cold. I mean, obviously you can practice your talk and your pacing and your timing in front of a mirror or just in your own room, and that's a good idea too. But there's no substitute for practicing or having a dry run with real people.
Yeah, there's nothing like having someone else to point out the things that you've kind of gone willingly blind to as you're practicing it yourself. It's just like when you submit a paper to an editor, you're like, oh, there's 10 things that I just kind of blanked out because for whatever reason, I didn't want to see them. So I think that's great advice. I mean, also just getting comfortable presenting to another person and like having the presence of an audience, which totally changes for me the feel when I'm, I can run through a presentation on my own and just kind of like read a script, but from telling it to someone else, so much more nervous.
You should just assume that you're too close to your own subject to properly and dispassionately judge it. That's really why you need an external view. You do know your stuff, but you're too close to your stuff. It's you need some distance, some separation.
Yeah, and I did want to ask. I mean, you've presented to NASA engineers, Buddhist monks, and first graders. So, what role does your audience play in what you choose to say, even not knowing what is going on underneath the surface or what they might be bringing to like listening to your talk?
So you should, do your homework, find out what your audience is. In the first example I gave, when I was just a first year graduate student and I was speaking at the observatory in Edinburgh for their public evening, I asked the organizer, I said, well, who comes to these things? Do people just pour out of the pub drunk and they're all liquored up and totally happy, or is it families? Is it younger, older people? How much do they know? And so find out as much as you can about your audience. I mean, not to the point of spoiling. It's nice to have a little suspense or a little surprise. You want to be fresh into a new situation, but find out what you can, of course. And yes, you have to tailor your presentation to your audience, and that's tricky because, as we said, the pitching, the level you pitch at is tricky, and you may have a mixed audience, and that makes it harder still. You worry. That's another anxiety. You worry, oh, if I hit the middle ground, there's going to be people that know stuff that are just bored, and people who don't know anything who still aren't keeping up, and so I'm not pleasing anyone. I mean, that would be an anxiety you would have, and I think that's a misplaced anxiety, because that's unlikely to be the case. Most people who go to a research talk or science or whatever the subject is, they go in because they're interested. They have the choice, right? This is free choice learning, if you like. People who choose to go to that as opposed to go to another event or go to a concert or whatever. So they're choosing to be there. That's a good thing. But you do have to pitch it. So in those three examples you gave, if I'm talking to NASA engineers, I know that they may not actually know that much astronomy, but they're super technically savvy, and they want the juice of all those technical details about what I'm talking about. They love the details. Engineers are very detail oriented. So you just feed them lots of good details, lots of good hard numbers about stuff, and they love it. First graders, of course, they're going to just sit there and squirm on the ground in front of you, and you gotta bring toys, bring show and tell, bring demos, bring things you can hand around. Don't talk too long, speak in short sound bites, engage them, literally engage them, walking among them and ask them questions, or pick on people and say, what do you think about that? Or you're smiling, why are you smiling? Or, so first graders, it's different again. And then, just other audiences, whether I say Buddhist monks are different again. They're a kind of ideal audience because they're just open receptacles for knowledge and super interested and super positive about things. So they're almost the easiest people I've ever talked to.
The Graduate Center put on a research presentation competition this year where students from all over U of A could present their research in 3 minutes or less and have it judged by an audience and by real judges. And we had the opportunity to interview a few of the presenters, and what we noticed was the STEM students felt like they were at a disadvantage compared to the humanities students because they thought the humanities students could evoke more like pathos, or it lent itself more to the compact presentation format because STEM students felt like they had so much to explain and stuff like that. So I was wondering if you knew any tips and tricks to make technical or scientific presentations more understandable and exciting.
Sure. I mean, yeah, you're talking about Grad Slam, which is a great thing. It's a nationwide phenomenon too, and it's very well represented here at U of A. Yeah, so this is a significant issue. So there's a real thing to address in this where it's not the same in every field. One of the challenges of science, and this is true teaching science too, at any level, say to non-science majors, is, science has scaffolding. It's knowledge that builds on knowledge. And so it does sometimes take a while to develop an idea because you have to create a base coat of paint. These are the laws of physics. We need to understand those. Now we work out how these laws of physics apply in this regime or in this part of the universe. And now we see what the limitations of their application are and what the interesting questions are. So you have to build that, and that can be done quickly. So, I mean, the science students who worry about that, it's a real thing. It is in principle more cumbersome to build the scaffolding of understanding science from ground zero than it is in the humanities and arts subject, for the simple reason that, if you're talking about music or art or architecture, everyone can appreciate a painting or a beautiful building or a piece of music or whatever. So they start with a level of understanding and appreciation. It's there right away. Whereas if you're talking about physics or chemistry or biology, they may start with nothing. And so I agree, and I'm sympathetic to the science students who feel that. That's a real thing. So, but it doesn't mean you don't have answers, remedies, or tools. So the main tool, I would say, especially when it comes to a 3-minute presentation, which is very challenging anyway, that's a difficult format, is storytelling, right? The thing that unifies scholarly activity or research in any subject is just a human activity. It's not done yet by robots and AIs, right? It's done by people. And so there are stories about how research is done. It may be a fieldwork story. I was out in the field with my hammer chipping away rocks and it's a geology thing. Or I went to a telescope and, I gathered some data. Or it's just, or some story in the lab, and there's always interesting things, mishaps and chaos and things that happen in the lab. So you've got to make a hook, and a storytelling hook is the best way. It could be a story about the science or the issue you're talking about, but it's better that it's a human story to start with. You could even be a story about one of the pioneers in the field and the sort of, famous, iconic story of how they discovered something or how they went down the wrong path and then realized they'd gone down the wrong path. So even at the expense of taking some of your precious time, especially if it's 3 minutes, but just assume it's a talk where you have a little more than that. That's a great way of baiting the hook for people to be interested and giving it a human interest and a human element. So there are other methods and strategies too, but that's the single best one. And the science especially benefits from that because it gets away from the stereotype that it's just, disembodied people in a lab, dispassionate people with no emotions running experiments and using machines to learn something, and who cares about that? That doesn't sound very interesting. Another one I would put in almost in the same league is first it's useful again in science, but it can be used in any field, is to use analogies and metaphors, and you can talk about the thing, but you don't have to talk about the thing. You can make an association with something else, and the something else can be much more familiar to people. I mean, a great example just from a few days from the first release of the James Webb Space Telescope images. Several of the scientists made the point. They obviously figured this out ahead of time. It was a good strategy. They were trying to convey this deep field and this image with thousands of fuzzy blobs in their galaxies. And it's a wow image, but it's much more of a wow image when they say, okay, well, this is some image taken with a telescope, but the field, the area of sky you're looking at is the size of a grain of sand held at arm's length. And then you go, oh, wow, there's thousands of galaxies in the size of a grain of sand held at arm's length. And in your head, you're going, how many grains of sand could you fit across the sky times thousands? That's how many galaxies there are. And you don't have to connect the dots. You just give people that image of a grain of sand at arm's length, and then they relate it to the image. So that was a beautiful example just from this James Webb data release. But there are many ways to do that kind of a thing. You could just say, as a scientist or astronomer, you could say, well, we believe there's 200, 300 billion galaxies in the observable universe. Okay, that's a factual statement. But most people don't know what 200 billion is. But if you say, here's an image, think how many galaxies you can see if you really stared at it down to the details. Okay, here's what tiny fraction of the sky that is. Now you do the math in your head. You don't have to do it, but it gets to the same number. That's how you get that number.
Huh. Yeah, and you don't need to know any of the equations. There's much less knowledge building. Like there's some introductory, like this is what we're talking about, but it's really just a natural assumption that everybody can make. So that actually kind of answers my next question, which was, how can we replace jargon and complex equations with examples?
It's a big challenge, and I struggled with it early on. I mean, it took a lot of practice before I probably still fall into it. I mean, my best little anecdotal example from the U of A of the prevalence of jargon in young professionals, graduate students, is I go to I used to be associate dean in the College of Science, and I preside over the award ceremonies for the best students, our graduating seniors, and the best students or the best graduate student in every department. And there'd be a beautiful ceremony where there'd be some food and there'd be speeches, and the students would all mingle beforehand. And I listen in on their conversations, and it was pretty funny because they were all talking completely past each other, because whether they were in these were science, but still they're different science fields. Not everyone speaks the same language. A geneticist and an astronomer don't use the same jargon. So the astronomy student and the biology student and the psychology student, they were talking excitedly about their research, and I could see the incomprehension but enthusiasm in the person they were talking to, because when you're a young professional, you're fired up on your subject. We talked about it. You're learning for the first time. You're feeling the power of the knowledge. And the truth is that jargon, it's not a pejorative. It has a purpose. It's there. It's a shorthand. It's the language of your field or your subfield. And it's a shorthand. It stops you from having to explain a bunch of stuff in much more cumbersome ways. So it totally serves a purpose. It's the language you talk to your peers with. But when you go to the public setting or any setting like that, you have to dislocate yourself from that thought mindset. And of course, you're having to untrain yourself from using modes of speech that you use all the time in the lab and with your colleagues in your department. So that was interesting to see the students at this ceremony unwittingly blowing away their own colleagues because they were enthusiastic but not really communicating very well. So how do you avoid the jargon? Well, it's back to having a practice talk with people who are not in your field. As long as you have friends or colleagues or roommates or family members who are honest, and you've got to set them up to be honest, they need to, you can get them to make a jargon signal that they hold up or whatever. There are different ways they could signal it. Each time you can just tell them ahead of time, I'm going to do my practice talk. Every time you don't understand something or use jargon, do something, do this signal or whatever. And then you can still get through your presentation, but you're suddenly aware of how often you're doing it or not. So, so that's again why the practice talk is useful. But you sort of have to train yourself to do it. And in the end, you're sort of training yourself to do two different kinds of things. You're training yourself, as always in your field, to give a professional presentation, to give a talk. It might be a job talk, it might be very high stakes. You absolutely want to show how much you know and how smart you are and how much you're in the field, which means knowing that jargon, talking at high level. But then when you give the public talk, you got to swap personas and you got to be someone slightly different. And you got to do that. That's a conscious thing. You actually have to be able to make that switch.
Yeah, and I think just being conscious of it is probably a great way to start.
There's other tools you can use. It's again, you don't want to read your talk like a speech, like from a script, but it's not a bad idea, especially if it's the first times you've done it. It's not a bad idea to have a transcript of what you actually said. And there's pretty free plugins and tools that can take, you can do your talk and it can transcribe it in a word processor in front of you. And that's useful too, because the machine only has a limited vocabulary. So if you use jargon, it won't know what those words are, and you will see them come up as gobbledygook on the screen. But assuming that it captures most of them, just seeing your script will allow you to identify. You can't always hear yourself when you're talking in real time, right? But if you saw your speech, your talk written out, then it would help you identify it. There's a fascinating book done, it's a while ago now, by Carlo Rovelli, and it led to other books in different fields, where he took the challenge of writing a book about cosmology, about the universe, using the 1,000 most common words in the English language. And that's difficult. So that was a masterpiece. That was a tour de force, and it's been done by a few other people, the similar concept. And so that's I'm not suggesting that as an actual discipline, but it would be very interesting if you were giving a public talk or writing a popular article. Could you do it within and make it seem flow and be meaningful and be interesting using the 1,000 most common words in the English language? I mean, I would say that's a super challenge. But it's how you head strongly in the direction of not obfuscating or blowing people away with jargon.
When you're presenting to an audience that might not be familiar with examples that would work for, the general populace, like say the monks in the Himalaya, how do you localize your presentation to maybe fit with that audience?
Well, so again, it's context and local conditions really matter. So when I'm in India, and these are Tibetans in exile, so it actually is in India where I go to do this. I'm sort of aware. I do my homework and understand what the monastic tradition is and what they are taught and haven't been taught. And I pretty much have to start at ground zero. And so that probably has made me, those times going to India to teach the monks and nuns, has made me as sensitive as I ever get to not assuming any background knowledge about physics, astronomy, or the universe. But then you can, use local conditions, use examples from their culture, so what I do there is in the monastic tradition, Tibetan tradition, there's a strong debate tradition. That's how they practice their theology, their argumentation practice is one-on-one debates. And it's almost gladiatorial. It seems very competitive when you see it, but very good natured and competitive. So I would just, rather than just talk or lecture at them, which is never a good idea anyway, we should use cooperative, peer learning processes. I would just engage them, get them to do their debate. I give them some ideas, some seeds, some provocative notions or issues that astronomers or scientists wrestle with, and ask them to debate them in the group, and then change roles and debate them again. So that's an example of using their practice. They're part of their monastic practice and translating it into science and learning about science. And if you're in a different situation, you can do the same thing. I mean, if you think you're dealing with very strong visual learners, then, go overboard on your visuals and bring along show and tell objects. If it's a young audience, obviously tactile is good when you're dealing with kids. So again, be just as appropriate as you can to your audience. Use the modalities of presentation, learning, and engagement with material that they would tend to prefer or they would use anyway.
Yeah, that takes it a step further than I imagined it would go. Because when I, wrote localize your presentation, I was like, oh, use local objects, use familiar examples or things like that. But using like their cultural style of learning, of debate, is a whole different level of kind of presenting, like, just sharing your ideas through a completely different, basically medium. So
Yeah.
that's really cool.
But using local, just geographically local ideas or examples, that's also great. If you're traveling and you're giving a talk in Baltimore, a place that you don't know very well and you've never been even, doing a little work to put something like that into your presentation. In astronomy, the classic example is when you're doing scale model of the solar system. Most people have trouble conceptualizing how small the planets are compared to the space between them and the distance to the sun. So we use scale models for the solar system. In the U of A, it's the Flandreau Dome is the sun. Where would all the planets be? And of course, if that's your scale model, the outer planets are barely in Tucson. It's that big a model. So if you were in another place, in another town, city, country, doing your work, do a little legwork ahead of time and present them with a scale model of the solar system that fits Paris or Cleveland or wherever it is you happen to be. So that would be a direct way of localizing what you're saying, or just reference. It doesn't have to, I'm using astronomy examples, but it doesn't even have to reference that. It could reference, you could somehow reference their sports team or their, the popular people, local iconic figures in the place you are. That just, it's a clever trick too, because it gets your audience with you. You're some outsider maybe just walking in and they're interested in the subject, but they don't know you and they don't know if you know them or their situation. And so if you reference something that's very, close to them, like their sports team or whatever, then it shows that you cared, that you did a little homework and that you weren't just giving some, cookie cutter thing that you could have, oh, if it's Tuesday, it must be Cleveland, like the jaded band going around the country and they don't change their playlist for anyone.
Or how does passion for your topic factor into your work?
It's important. I mean, and it's an interesting question because it's not obvious how, like if you hide your passion too much, you just decide. I mean, and that can be not for a bad reason. It could be just because you're anxious or nervous. It's very hard to appear ebullient or passionate when you're really tightly wound and anxious and nervous, and you're going to be talking fast and you may have some motion tics or verbal tics and so on. So unfortunately, the displaying what is your innate passion about what you do is more challenging in some of these situations because there's anxiety, there's performance anxiety, there's the strangeness of it and so on. And there's the mode of trying to be very professional and very controlled and get it right and don't go off the rails. So that beats against the passion, but you have to somehow recognize that it's by no means a demerit. It's actually obviously a bonus to just show how excited you are about what you do, and that's I think you should do that. I mean, I'm just assuming that it's there, and it's a good thing to let it out. I mean, and obviously you can't go to the other extreme and just be so breathless and euphoric, and that that they're looking at each other in the audience and saying, "What's he smoking?" or "What's going on there?"
It's got really likes geography.
A little wild here, Yeah. But yes, scientists are fighting, especially, and other academics, other disciplines similarly. You're fighting some stereotypes, the nerds in the ivory tower and so on. And so, it counteracts that immediately when you can show that you're excited, visibly excited about what you're talking about, that you care about it a lot. And by transmission, you want your audience to care about it, and they probably will. It's infectious, right? Humor is infectious, passion is infectious. And so these are good attributes.
Yeah, but I think that touches on something that's so important, which is that a lot of the students I meet are so passionate about their topics that it makes them nervous to talk about it because they're going to be sharing this thing that they care about with like relative strangers. What are they going to think? What are they going to say? So I think a lot of our instinctive reactions are to cover that up with layers of professionalism and kind of detach from the topic, but leaning into, and showing that we care about it. as a way to actually, invite positive judgment from the audience is great advice.
It's again a business of displacement. You have to, just like to understand how your presentation is perceived, you can't do that in your own head. Or even by listening or in a mirror or you need the separation, you need displacement. And so for this is another case where you need displacement, because when you try hard and sound very controlled and professional, and you think that's you being just very tightly controlled and professional and knowing your stuff, you need the displacement to sense that someone might actually view that as a somewhat inert way of presenting it, that it's not very engaging, right? To sound that way. They might recognize that you know your stuff, but it leaves them cold, right? So you need the displacement to understand that. And similarly, if you're euphoric and excited about your subject, the displacement, I think, goes in the right direction, where they're gonna, even if they don't really understand it, maybe you are actually leaving them behind on some things, but they're sitting there thinking, wow, that gal's excited. I'm excited too. I'm excited for them and with them. So, you're just carrying them along on this wave of what it is that got you into the thing in the first place, even if you're not fully transmitting the information. So it's a way, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to hit that perfect transmission of information and content. That's not always the goal.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything we haven't touched on?
I mean, I would probably just loop back to sort of what we started with, that it has, academia and students doing scholarly activities. The landscape has changed. A generation ago when I came up, it was relatively unusual for young professionals, especially graduate students, to do much public speaking or popular writing or any of those things. And the game has changed. So, as I said, there's two levels of what I would call obligation associated with this, being funded by the taxpayer and dealing with the tide of misinformation. The third one, more positively, is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to learn a new skill. I mean, to be a professional in a completely different way, because not everyone is equally good at it, because not everyone really tries to be good at it. And if you try to be good at it, it's like teaching. This trope that there are natural born teachers. I'm not a natural born teacher. That's just garbage. It's a skill. And science communication or communication with the public in any subject is a skill. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. And if you commit yourself to it, it doesn't have to take all your time, just in the margins. And it can be refreshing because it's a different thing from your lab work or your scholarly work or what you talk about with your peers and colleagues. You can get good at it. And by the time you graduate and go into the profession, you're probably in the top tier of people in your field doing that kind of thing. Because many of the older people never did it and never cared about it. And it's almost too late for them. And so they voted with their feet. And so, you're in a good category. And when it doesn't make the difference, of course, it's not the game changer or clincher if you come to apply for a faculty job or something like that. But it does matter. It does matter in the margins, and everything is very competitive. So having that skill, that extra string in your bow, it does matter. I mean, everyone's, of course, going to first look at your research and your scholarly work. And they might want to know whether you can teach or not and have you guest lecture in a class if you visit for a faculty job or something like that. But if you could, if you go on a job circuit, if you like, and you make it known that you're willing to give a public lecture as well as teach a guest lecture, then wow, that'll be well received, and that will mark you out from probably most of the applicants. So the third tier, the research, teaching, and service, that's the academic parsing of workload, which is 40-40-20 for most faculty here and elsewhere. But that third one is the sort of Cinderella, the service, because it's like, oh, you sit on a committee or you were on peer review for NASA or NSF or something like that. But I think increasingly that third stool, the third leg of the stool of academic work is now outreach and public communication, because that's what's needed the most. That's what's really needed for the reasons we've talked about. So if you burnish that skill and get going with it early on, you're going to be in a really fast track on that all the way through the profession, all the way through your advancement, and you'll benefit from it. And who knows, you might be the Carl Sagan of your field in the end, or the Neil deGrasse Tyson of your field.
I think that's an amazing note to end on, and good advice to any students who are now looking to augment their professional skill sets, learn more about their own career, and just all the benefits that we've talked about that public speaking can add. So I guess all that there is left to say is thank you so much for meeting with me and sharing all of this information. It's been amazing.